Welcome to the Joy Lab podcast, where we help you uncover and foster your most joyful self. Your hosts, Dr. Henry Emmons and Dr. Amy Prasek, bring you the ideal mix of soulful and scientifically sound tools to spark your joy, even when it feels dark. When you're ready to experiment with more joy, combine this podcast with the full Joy Lab program over at joylab.coach.
Hello, I'm Henry Emmons, and welcome to Joy Lab.
And I'm Amy Prasek. So here at Joy Lab, we infuse science with soul to help you uncover joy. To do that, we focus on building the elements of joy, the positive emotions and inner states that become the building blocks for joyful life. So the element for this episode is sympathetic joy. And if you're like me, when I first heard that term, I didn't resonate with it. I think of sympathy being more in line with compassion and being with sort of someone else's suffering. So it cues up sadness for me. But sympathy, I suppose, is really a neutral term. So we're capturing this other side of it, sympathizing with someone else's joy.
Yeah, maybe we should come up with another term, Amy, something that's a little more relatable.
Yes.
So, the idea is that you're not alone in this, that you can share in someone else's joy. So what do you think about multiplied joy?
Yeah. Well, actually, that makes me think of Multiplicity. Was that movie with, what's his name? Michael Keaton. So yes, I'll go with multiplicity joy.
Okay.
You got another one?
No. How about shared joy?
Yeah, that's pretty obvious. I like that one. I also think of Fast and Furious joy, because there's like 47 sequels. So it suggests that upward spiral, I think. Any others?
You like your sequels?
I do. I love my movies.
How about vicarious joy?
Yes. Actually, I really like vicarious joy. I think we'll go with that. So maybe there's a term that you listening want to suggest as well. So please, we're open for any other suggestions. But I think what I really do like about this element is that it's a great follow-up from gratitude for sure, the last element we worked on. They're just both really built on our connections, our relationships, and these elements bring us together in ways that feel really good, and it can happen really quick. Sympathetic joy or vicarious joy also feels like it takes gratitude to another level. So we're really kind of stepping it up here. I also like that we work on this element amidst some big holiday seasons. It's another reminder that we can certainly do the gifts and such, but there's so much more to share beyond that. Sharing our struggles, absolutely, but sharing joy too. And instead of just feeling like an outsider, cheering someone on, with sympathetic joy, it's this idea that we're really sharing in that joy, like it fills us up too.
Yeah, I know we talk about this a lot, but I think that the greatest obstacle to joy is the belief, which we pretty much all buy into, that we are really separate from one another, that we're isolated. And sympathetic joy just shatters that belief. The truth is, what happens to you does also affect me. Now, for a lot of us, that seems clear when it's something bad that happens to somebody else, because, we can feel that ourselves. There's even something called vicarious trauma, which therapists, for example, or emergency workers can experience because they just work with so many people who have experienced trauma. But what we're talking about here is vicarious joy. Happiness can spread from person to person just like trauma can. And it does reduce our sense of isolation because we actually feel the connection with them if we can just let ourselves feel, to take in the joy that this other person seems to be feeling.
Yeah, this element really does shatter that belief. Like you said, Henry, that isolation. Maybe that's why it can be surprisingly hard sometimes to practice it, because that belief can be hard to shake sometimes. There are, however, lots of ways to practice it. So in episode 9, we shared that great Dalai Lama insight on sympathetic joy. So he said, why rely just on your own good fortune to be happy? If there are 8 billion people in the world and you can be happy for their good fortune, then you have just increased your chances of being happy by 8 billion times. So that's our title for this episode, because we really are presented with billions of opportunities to soak up joy alongside others. And we'll get into some more specific ways to do that, to take advantage of those 8 billion opportunities. But first, I want to hit on an interesting obstacle. We'll also get into a few more obstacles later on in episode 38. But for this one, I'll just highlight it by asking Henry a question. So, Henry, how much focus did you have in your medical training on how humans can bring in more good stuff into their lives, versus just getting rid of what feels bad or what is ailing them?
You want an exact number?
You could probably put it on one hand. How many minutes?
I don't think there was any, Amy. When I was doing my psychiatry training, I think there was some of that in the family systems work that we were doing. Family systems, kind of the early creation of that, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, I think there was quite a bit of joy in it, actually. Some of the early pioneers were really charismatic people. But ironically, during my residency training, I ended up taking some classes at a local seminary because they were teaching this stuff, and also some classes on Jung or Jungian psychology, because, although that's very deep and reflective, there's some joy or some good stuff in that too. But positive psychology, the kind of stuff we're talking about now, it really wasn't very well developed then, but also there was none of it in my training.
Yeah, you had to go all the way to the chapel across the way to
that's right,
to get it in, huh? Yeah. I just think it's fascinating how little we focus on in healthcare in regard to actually caring for the entire self. It's certainly changing, as you said, Henry, but there's just so much focus on getting rid of things like losing weight, not having those thoughts, stop smoking, don't talk like that. All these ways of sort of not being, and rarely any support on bringing in things that fill us up. It's like we're only given red buttons and told to sit there and don't press them. Like, give me some green buttons to mess with. And that's what Joy Lab is, I feel like. It's a lot of green buttons that we put out.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Green button lab. Anyway, so I'm a researcher. That's my training. I love to burrow in all this research. And like in practice, as you just highlighted, Henry, there's not a whole lot directly about sympathetic joy either. And bringing in this good stuff. It's growing, though, because it works.
Yeah, I think there are probably a lot of outside forces that just keep encouraging us to focus on what's wrong. So like, in healthcare, for example, physicians, and I think therapists too, are trained to look for what's wrong and fix it. That's kind of our job.
Yeah.
And, insurance pays us to treat illness, not to make people feel good. So, news feeds and social media, they just all encourage us to see problems or to feel fearful because it generates more clicks, it gets more attention. Even political campaigning, it's the negative campaigning that appears to work because it gets people's attention, it sticks in their minds more than saying good things. So I think that there are also, aside from these external factors, there are some internal things at work here too. Admittedly, I'm part of this. We are drawn to drama. We like juicy gossip. We like flawed characters, it seems, more than people who are just really healthy. They don't seem that interesting.
Pretty boring.
So, the positivity just doesn't seem quite as compelling. And it might even feel a little boring for a while if your life is just going along really well. And some of us may even create a little drama just to, shake things up after a bit. And I think too that it's hard to give our attention to people who seem happy if we are not. So you hear the phrase that misery loves company. I'm not sure that's true, but I don't think misery loves the company of someone who's happier than
Right.
you are at the time, because it just doesn't feel good to compare to that.
Yeah, it's really hard to be amidst happiness. Yeah, you just sit there and compare when you're not feeling it. Dr. Rick Hansen, he's a neuroscientist. He often says our brain is like Velcro for negative experiences, but Teflon for positive ones. And that feels even more real when you're in misery, I think. It's like that Velcro for negative experiences that you can hardly peel apart. But sympathetic joy has some teeth too. I think it can get in there. And so that's what we're talking about today. And in episode 9, which I'd encourage you all to check out if you haven't, we got into some interesting research that sits on sort of the periphery of this element of sympathetic joy. Essentially, how the science of how our emotions and inner states spread. And the word that's often used is emotional contagion. The idea here is that our mental and physical states are impacted by the emotions and states of those around us, meaning we catch and spread emotions and all the sensations that come along with it. In episode 9, we also talked about a few terms: neural resonance, or brain-to-brain coupling, and autonomic synchronization. So these tell kind of the same story as contagion, really, but go a bit deeper, I suppose, because they describe that situation when someone experiences an emotion and all these associated areas of their brain lights up. And when we see them experience that emotion, the same areas of our brain will light up. And in some cases, we don't even have to see their emotion, like their affect, to catch that emotion. This is the case particularly with folks we feel closer to, like a friend or family member. So we interact with them, will likely match up with their mood and physiology in certain ways. Things like stress hormones, respiration rate line up, which is obvious in so many ways with someone you're familiar with, like your closest friend is in a bad mood. And so you just come into the room and you start to feel it. Your mood starts to shift. Even before you've said anything, you just notice a shift. And you're like, okay, what's going on? And so maybe the problem here is that it also seems, as we've discussed, that negative emotions tend to be more transmissible. We talked about that in episode 30 when we talked about the negativity bias or survival bias. So the research on contagion and related phenomena really demonstrate that whether we like it or not, the emotional states of those around us impact us. And this is a big deal if you're not aware of your own inner state or don't have some skills to buffer what's coming at you.
Yeah. Wow. If you don't believe in emotional contagion, just look at what happened to our economy in the crash of 2008, which almost seems too long ago to remember now, but it was really all driven by fear. And it just spread. That fear spread like wildfire. More recently, we can look at the start of the pandemic, which was kind of similar. It was almost like there was a shadow infection, a pandemic of fear that was spreading at the same time. So, it's especially important at this moment to know how to work with these forces, because we are so instantly connected with what's going on around the world. And there's so much information, including negativity, coming at us. It's very, very hard to filter all of this out. So, many folks respond to this by disconnecting, by dividing up into tribes. So you just spend time or talk with people who see the world like we do. That might seem appealing at first, but is it really what's best for our mental well-being? So we recently came across some interesting research that suggests it is not. The researchers compared 4 really, really big studies following a total of 50,000 people, which is a lot for studies like this. And they were looking at the relationship between their social interactions and their degree of happiness. What they found might seem counterintuitive at first, because it is not the amount of social interaction that you have, or even the type of activities you're doing. It's not even the closeness of the people you interact with that matters most. What best predicts happiness is what they called the relational diversity of one's social portfolio. Researchers like you, Amy, love terms like the relational diversity of one's social portfolio. So I'm going to ask you to tell us, what does this mean exactly?
Yeah. Actually, it's funny. When I was starting on my PhD, I had a journalism mentor that said, don't do it. You're going to become the worst communicator if you do it. I was like, no, I want him to be so much smarter. And he was right. It's terrible. Yes. It is an interesting study. I don't understand the financial metaphor, though. It's definitely a lot of jargon. Again, as we discussed a few episodes ago, I generally work with wooden coins, so this is not my forte. But nonetheless, yes, I can break it down. So this study is really building on the solid evidence that having social connections is essential for well-being. But one of the questions that this study was looking at was the type of social connections. What type might matter more, if any. So they were comparing strong tie interactions, meaning interacting with our closest friends and family, and weak tie interactions, which were interactions with folks that participants didn't feel so close to, like acquaintances, colleagues, neighbors, people you see at the coffee shop, strangers even, but those that you'll sort of cross a path with and interact with informally. So the researchers found that having a diverse group of folks in your network, meaning having weak tie interactions and strong tie interactions, was a strong predictor of well-being, subjective well-being, more so than just those with strong tie interactions. So both, right? Strong and weak. To kind of make sense of this, I like to think of this as the Kevin Bacon effect. 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
That's another movie reference.
Oh my God, yeah, I can't stop. So the more we could stretch out our network, the closer we can get to Kevin Bacon, thus the happier we'll be, is how I see this. But really the idea is that you need some strong tie relationships, yes. You don't need many though. Dunbar's numbers, if you recall from some episodes ago. But those relationships can certainly create a really strong web sort of around you, and that's important. So those strong ties matter. But those weak ties allow us to grow that web, that network, so that we have more touch points, more support, more opportunities, a diversity of that support and opportunities and touch points, which can be for everything. More opportunities to keep the center of our web strong, even more support when you're in a bind or you're sick. When you have that wider web or that network, it's easier to get a job or just a cup of sugar if you're making a banana bread and you're short some sugar. So it's really interesting how these weak ties actually touch so many aspects of our lives. And if we just stay in that bubble, that little bubble of strong tie relationships, and only interact with those few folks, we just do not have the same opportunities.
I love it when research helps us sort out what's actually most helpful to do.
Kevin Bacon helped us do that.
You're right. So in Joy Lab, we try to take lessons from science and turn them into practices that anybody can do, really accessible practices. We try to be intentional to turn these findings into experiments we can do for ourselves so that we can cultivate the inner states that correlate with joy. So when we practice sympathetic joy or vicarious joy, it helps us to realize at a deep level how interconnected we all are. Now, we might agree with this already at an intellectual level, but to really know it in your bones, that takes practice. And that's because it requires of us a huge paradigm shift, a change in our way of thinking. It is so ingrained in us that we are separate, that we are not connected. And we can't change that belief without giving it some attention. Now, that does not, however, mean that it has to be really hard to do.
Yeah, they don't have to be so hard. As the title, again, of this episode suggests, we've got 8 billion little tips for you. So I'll start with number 1. You can do them in any order. No,
this is going to be a long episode.
Set your DVRs. Yes, let's focus on one strategy with folks that you'll likely see in the next few weeks, particularly given that you might be listening to this amidst the holiday season. But if you're not, this absolutely applies anyway.
Yeah, I think we agree 8 billion is just too much. So we're suggesting that you come up with 3 people who you know, who seem to you to be genuinely happy. And genuine means that it's not just a show of happiness. They aren't just packing their days full of fun stuff or just, being social all the time. So look, for example, for somebody who just seems comfortable in their own skin. Someone who stays, pretty steady when things get really stressful, or just even who seems able to savor the little things in life. So we'll take a lesson from the research on relational diversity and suggest that if you want, you can broaden your social portfolio here. So if you know 3 people in your close circle who seem really happy, that's great. Start with them. But if not, just feel free to look outside that circle and try to come up with 3 people you know well enough that you could, if you wanted to, have a little conversation with them. So the idea here is to spend some time with someone who is happy and then just see what happens. So we are testing this hypothesis that joy might be contagious, that it may spread from someone who has it to you. It might be more powerful if you do this in person. So you could just, give them a call or text and suggest that you hang out together for a little while. But if that feels like too much or seems uncomfortable, this can be done as a mental exercise too. You don't have to be with them in person. So just even taking the time to visualize yourself sitting with this other person, you're just chatting, maybe sharing a cup of coffee or a beer or something, and you're laughing together. Just imagining it even might be enough. Try it and see. And to make it even more tangible, see if you can describe at least 2 qualities about this person that makes you feel good. Write them down in your journal if you have one.
Yeah, I love this little exercise. I'll add a twist to consider. You can just think of one person that you might see in the next 10 days or so. And I think, as Henry said, you might stretch your portfolio out. Those weak tie relationships are good places to look as well. It's funny when you start to think about that. Like, I can think of John, our male person for 10 years, who was just one of the most wonderful humans. I didn't interact much, but I could write many qualities down. Some neighbors that used to give our dogs popsicles. So it doesn't have to be anything specific necessarily that you would see in a How to Be Happy book. These are things that fill you up or that make you smile. It can be small, but you can write those qualities down. There are joyful people around you. And so you can start with that mental exercise that Henry just described and write down things about that person that make you feel happier. And maybe when you see that person, just notice if you feel a little better in their presence. And if you can, try to chat with them. Maybe tell them that you're doing this practice on cultivating joy and you thought of them as someone who makes you feel happier when you're near them or think about them.
I love it. And if you do have this conversation, try to notice whether there is a lift in the mood when they hear how you feel about them. And just notice whether that seems to happen for both you and that other person. That is shared joy.
Yeah, I hope these little practices seem possible because that shared joy is so powerful. And in our next episode, we'll actually have a sympathetic joy meditation for you. I really encourage you to give it a whirl. I think you'll find it surprisingly powerful, and it could be some good fuel, some motivation to help work on the other strategies that we just mentioned too. So to close our time together today, I'll share a quote from Sharon Salzberg, really awesome teacher who has offered a lot around this element of sympathetic joy. This is from her book, The Art of Mindful Connection. The practice of sympathetic joy is rooted in inner development. It's not a matter of learning techniques to make friends and influence people. Instead, we build the foundations of our own happiness. When our own cup is full, we more easily share it with others.
Thank you for listening to the Joy Lab podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, visit joylab.coach to learn more about the full Joy Lab program. Be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.